Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. On today's video, we're continuing with our ongoing series entitled Prove the Complexity Factors. And today we're in session 5 of this ongoing series. And I have a fascinating program for you today. And today we're going to talk about how to prove the complexity factors that surface after the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee. And so far in this program, we've been discussing the complexity factors and where those complexity factors make themselves known and where they make themselves evident. And we talked first about the complexity factors that you can capture and handle actually even before meeting with the examinee in the face-to-face evaluation. So those are complexity factors that can be captured before the face-to-face evaluation. And then we talked about complexity factors that have to be captured at the face-to-face evaluation. And then we're now moving into the complexity factors that can be captured after the face-to-face evaluation. So before we get into today's discussion, let's just briefly review some of the concepts that we've handled so far in this series. In video number 1, we talked about the necessity, the absolute necessity now in this new era of proving and documenting to the parties that your use of the complexity factors actually qualifies as true complexity factors. See, it's one thing to bill for complexity factors. It's another thing to have your complexity factors actually comport with the exact language of the law under CCR 9795. And because so many doctors have been disciplined for their misuse and abuse of the complexity factors, it's now more important than ever that we comply with the exact language of the law as the complexity factors are described under CCR 9795. And in video number 1, we talked about this. We also talked about how if you're going to bill for complexity factors in your report, that the sections of your report that deal with the complexity factors have to do an adequate job in demonstrating to the parties that your discussion and the opinions and conclusions that you result as a result of employing these complexity factors, these sections of your report have to be masterpiece sections of your report. And we said that the sections of your report that are the most important sections of your report are those sections of your report that have to deal with the complexity factors. So the review of records section of your report, the causation section of your report, the apportionment section of your report. These sections of your report should be masterpieces. They should be thorough. They should be lengthy. They should be comprehensive. They should be visually impressive. They should be formatted perfectly. These sections of your report are critical in demonstrating to the parties that you should be paid for your use of the complexity factors. So the take-home message is focus on those sections of your report that deal with the complexity factors. Other sections of your report, you can perhaps even reduce some time and de-emphasize those sections of your report that do not deal with the complexity factors. In video number 2, we talked about how you can capture the review of records and causation complexity factors even before the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee. And in actual fact, the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee begins approximately 3 to 4 weeks before the actual date of the scheduled meeting. So there are many things that you can do to prepare your report in the days and weeks preceding the actual face-to-face evaluation. And certainly 2 of the things that you can do in the days and weeks before the face-to-face evaluation is capture the complexity factors involved with review of records and also causation. In video number 3, we then brought the discussion to the complexity factors that are captured at the face-to-face evaluation. And we spent 2 videos talking about the complexity factors of causation, the complexity factors of face-to-face time, and the complexity factors of apportionment. We also talked about how the complexity factor that deals with the prior written agreement is the big daddy, is the big king of all the complexity factors. And so if you can actually obtain a prior written agreement from the parties in advance of the face-to-face evaluation, that complexity factor trumps all of the other complexity factors because it obviates and negates the need for you to cite and quote and prove that you complied with the other complexity factors. It's an all-encompassing, all-inclusive complexity factor. So in those cases that qualify for a prior written agreement, we talked about a procedure and a sequence of steps to actually obtain a prior written agreement from the parties. Now, obtaining a prior written agreement from the parties is not easy. I'll be the first to admit to you, but it's also not impossible. And with a bit of perseverance and some stick-to-itiveness, you can actually get a prior written agreement from the parties in greater than 50% of those cases wherein you request the prior written agreement. Okay? So that took us through videos number 3 and videos number 4 of this program. And with regards to the causation, apportionment, and also prior multiple injuries complexity factors, we talked about a series of interviewing questions to pursue in the face-to-face evaluation that will allow you to capture apportionment and prior multiple injuries as complexity factors. Now, these are 2 interesting complexity factors in that rarely do we ever get enough key data from the parties to be able to qualify for apportionment and prior multiple injuries as complexity factors. It seems that unearthing a prior history of industrial injuries on some examinees can be difficult, and many times by the time that we receive our materials, including claims cover letters and medical records from the parties have not sufficiently done their homework to determine if the examinee has a prior history of industrial injuries and whether or not apportionment and prior industrial injuries are complexity factors. And so there's many things that we can do ourselves, even in the absence of such data, to go into the face-to-face evaluation prepared enough to interrogate the examinee about these issues and to be able to unearth and discover a history of prior industrial injuries, a history of industrial injuries with prior employers, a history of injuries to same or similar body parts, both industrial and non-industrial. So largely, these 2 complexity factors are up to your discretion, and there's many things that you can do to take direct control over the use of these complexity factors, and we talked about that in great detail. Now, in today's discussion, we want to talk about the complexity factors that you can capture after the face-to-face evaluation. These are complexity factors that become evident to you after you've fully interviewed and fully examined the examinee, and in resolving the remaining issues, it may become necessary to do medical research, and it may become necessary to review additional medical records that have been generated either at or subsequent to the face-to-face evaluation. And so that brings into play 2 complexity factors. Number 1, medical research, as we discussed. And then the second one is the complexity factor that deals with 6 or more hours on 3 or more complexity factors. 6 or more hours on 3 or more complexity factors. And this is a complexity factor that allows you to qualify for both the ML 103 and ML 104 billing level. So I have a great discussion for you today. It's going to include many things that you can implement in your very next evaluation. So I'm going to go ahead and retrieve some additional notes, and I have some fascinating actual examples to share with you regarding medical research. So I'll go ahead and retrieve those references, and I've also provided those references to you as well so that you can look upon them with your own eyes. And I look forward to being back with you here in just a very few moments as we continue with our ongoing discussion entitled Prove the Complexity Factors. So I'll be back with you here very shortly. Okay, I'm back with you now, and I have my references with me. I hope you have your references with you as well. And today we're going to reference three sources of material. Number one, we're going to reference the California Code of Regulations 9795, which contains the current description of medical research as a complexity factor. We're going to also reference the Division of Workers' Compensation's newly proposed changes to the medical research complexity factor. And then we're going to reference also the recently published counter-proposed language to counter the DWC's proposed changes to the medical research complexity factor. So we have actual case law under CCR 9795, proposed changes to the law as described by the Division of Workers' Compensation, and then counter proposals to the Division of Workers' Compensation's proposed changes. Okay? So it's important to know that the medical research complexity factor could be soon changing. We have existing language, but that existing language could change. Well, regardless of what happens to the medical research complexity factor and how the ultimate language is decided, it's going to be forever important and always important that when you cite medical research as a complexity factor, you be able to prove that your use of the complexity factor comports with the exact language of the law as it exists at the time. So let's set up a couple of different scenarios and show how the language that we use in our report could comport with the current language, with the proposed change language, and then even to the counter-proposed language. Okay? So, as it currently exists, here is the definition of the medical research complexity factor under CCR 9795. It says 2 or more hours of medical research by the physician. An evaluator who specifies medical research as a complexity factor must also provide a list of citations to the sources reviewed and excerpt or include copies of medical evidence relied upon. Okay? So the language of the law gives us some instructions that we need to follow if we're going to employ medical research as a complexity factor. Well, before we talk about how to actually prove that your use of medical research qualifies as a complexity factor, let's review what the law states qualifies as medical research, and this is described under CCR 9793, 2 codes of regulation prior to CCR 9795. It says that medical research is the investigation of medical issues. Medical issues. It's not the investigation of administrative issues. It's not the investigation of legal issues. It's the investigation of medical issues. It includes investigating and reading medical and scientific journals and texts. Medical research does not include reading about the AMA guides, any edition. It does not include reading about treatment guidelines, including the ACOM guidelines. It does not include reading about the labor codes. It does not include reading about the regulations or publications of the divisions of workers' compensation, including the physician's guide or other legal materials. So medical research involves researching medical issues through reading medical and scientific journals and texts. Okay? So that's the current language of the law. Well, the Division of Workers' Compensation has proposed some changes to the language of the medical research complexity factor because they found over time in investigating qualified medical evaluators' use of the medical research complexity factor, they found some abuses of the use of medical research as a complexity factor. So they've proposed some changes in the language of the law in an effort to counteract those abuses. Okay? So the proposed change or the proposed changes to the language include the following. It says 2 or more hours of medical research by the physician. That's the same language. But here comes the new addition. Using sources that have not been cited in any prior medical report authored by the physician in the preceding 12 months in support of a claim citing or relying upon this complexity factor. An evaluator who specifies this complexity factor must also, number 1, explain in the body of the report why the research was reasonably necessary to reach a conclusion about a disputed medical issue. Number 2, provide a list of citations to the sources reviewed. And number 3, excerpt or include copies of medical evidence relied upon. All criteria, except the amount of hours, must also be satisfied to use medical research in combination under subdivision 4 and 5 of this code, and we'll talk about that in just a couple minutes. So the Division of Workers' Compensation has proposed some changes to the language of the medical research complexity factor to prevent doctors from using medical research repetitiously, the same medical research repetitiously over and over and over in the reports, and billing for the use of medical research over and over and over in their reports when they only did the medical research one time. It seems that qualified medical evaluators were using the same medical research. We're cutting and pasting into the body of their report the same medical research that they did once into multiple reports and expecting to capture medical research as a complexity factor in each of the multiple downstream reports that they authored. So the Division of Workers' Compensation identified the same medical research in multiple reports from the same qualified medical evaluator, but the qualified medical evaluator was billing for the medical research newly with each and every report. Well, that's the basis of the necessity for that change in language. And then in addition, the new proposed language to the medical research complexity factor requires that the qualified medical evaluator explain why was the research reasonably necessary? In other words, the Division of Workers' Compensation does not want us billing for medical research that's not necessary. That's not necessary to solve the disputed issue. Why would we bill for medical research that's not necessary? So the Division of Workers' Compensation is going to call us to task and demand that we explain why. Why is this medical research necessary? And the answer to the reason why had better be good. It better be actually necessary and pivotal that this information obtained throughout the course of your medical research be pertinent to resolving the disputed issue, Otherwise, the medical research complexity factor does not qualify and does not need to be reimbursed by the claims administrator. Now, imagine that you're a claims administrator and you're getting report after report citing medical research as a complexity factor. Wouldn't you want to know, okay, well, why is it necessary to do this medical research? And wouldn't you scrutinize the report and scrutinize the medical research to come to your own conclusion as to the actual necessity of the medical research in resolving the disputed issue? Wouldn't you do that? Well, trust me, the parties are doing that as well. And if your use of the medical research is not necessary to resolve the disputed issue, it's not going to be reimbursed. And your use of the medical research complexity factor does not actually comport with the language of the law, and it does not need to be reimbursed. And your report is certainly going to be downcoded if you're citing medical research that's not actually necessary to resolve the disputed issue. So in addition to that work of giving a reasonable explanation as to the necessity of the medical research, they then, like the current language requires, then require you to provide a list of the citations to the sources that you reviewed and excerpt or include copies of the medical evidence relied upon. And this makes sense. So when you cite medical research as a complexity factor, you have to show to the parties your research. You have to show them the research that you did. In other words, you have to show them the product, the end product of the medical research that you did. You have to show them the benefit to the report for the cost incurred in performing the medical research. So you can think of your medical research as sort of a sub-product of your qualified medical evaluation report. So what does your medical research consist of? It consists of physical pages, physical citations, physical references, physical articles, and then it also includes the conclusions that you drafted or that you obtained as a result of doing the medical research. So your medical research actually has mass. It's actually a physical product. It has a listing of citations, and it has a listing of opinions and conclusions that can only be obtained, can only be arrived at as a result of having done this necessary medical research. And I'll show you how to set that up within the body of your report here in a couple minutes. Now, I wonder how many of you remember that in May 2018, we had what was referred to as the QME Settlement Agreement. And the QME Settlement Agreement occurred when lawyers in Los Angeles arrived at a settlement in a lawsuit that they had against the Division of Workers' Compensation for disciplining doctors over what the Division of Workers' Compensation was citing as misuse of the complexity factors. Well, one of the complexity factors of concern, of course, had to deal with medical research. And so as part of that settlement agreement, there was some agreement reached between the parties as to the language of medical research. So let me just read to you the language from the QME Settlement Agreement. It said that in applying these regulations as written, in other words, in applying the medical research regulation, California Code of Regulation 9795, says, in applying these regulations as written, the Division of Workers' Compensation agrees not to impose any additional rule that a QME may not bill for medical research within his or her own area of specialty. The qualified medical evaluators, on the other hand, understand, pursuant to the quoted language of 9793 that medical research may not be billed for review of the AMA guides, treatment guidelines, or legal materials as set forth in the language of CCR 9793. So the Division of Workers' Compensation had a problem, had an issue with qualified medical evaluators billing for medical research within their own area of specialty. It was the opinion of the Division of Workers' Compensation that if you're a qualified medical evaluator, you're a specialist. We assume that when we hire you as a specialist, that you're fully versed, that you're fully knowledgeable, that you're fully qualified, and that you're fully expert in your own area of specialty. So, for example, I'm a chiropractor. It's assumed, or the Division of Workers' Compensation was proposing that it's assumed that as a chiropractor, I'm fully knowledgeable about all aspects of the field of chiropractic, and that any medical research necessary within my own field, for example, medical research related to back injuries, related to neck injuries, related to thoracic injuries, related to musculoskeletal injuries, would not be necessary because by virtue of my training and experience and my credential as a qualified medical evaluator, I'm already an expert, a qualified expert in my own area of specialty. Well, the QME settlement agreement made it clear that we are allowed to do medical research even within our own area of specialty. And this makes sense because it would seem to be a bit much to expect every single doctor to know everything that there is to know about their own area of specialty. And of course, as we know, that's just simply not realistic. So I'm going to give you some examples of some of the medical research that I've done, some of which have been in my own area of specialty, and some of which have been outside of my own area of specialty. Okay, so as the current language of the law exists now, we are allowed to do medical research even within our own area of specialty. Although that could certainly change at some point in the future, but that's how it exists as of the date of this recording. Okay? Now, the new proposed counter language to counter the stifling and conservative language as promulgated recently by the Division of Workers' Compensation is much more liberal. It simply states that medical research, in order to capture medical research as a complexity factor, it simply states an evaluator who performs medical research must also provide a list of citations to the sources reviewed and include or excerpt copies of medical evidence relied upon. Okay? So, on the one hand, we have the Division of Workers' Compensation's extremely conservative definition of medical research here, which has all these requirements. In other words, can't use the same source that you've used in the past 12 months, must explain in the body of the report the necessity of medical research, must provide a list of citations, and all this conservative language on the one hand. And then the other end of the spectrum is this very liberal definition of medical research, which simply says an evaluator who performs medical research. See, there's no description here of us documenting or proving the necessity of medical research. It simply gives us a carte blanche and green light invitation to go ahead and perform medical research. But in those cases where we do perform medical research, we must include a list of citations and excerpt copies of medical evidence relied upon. So all descriptions of the language of the medical research complexity factor, all descriptions, the current language of the law under CCR 9795, the Division of Workers' Compensation's proposed changes, and then the counter proposal to the Division of Workers' Compensation changes, all three languages of the medical research require that we provide a list of citations and excerpt or include copies of medical evidence relied upon. So there's a few action steps that are required under all descriptions of the medical research complexity factor. Now this is important because I've reviewed many doctors' reports where they cite medical research but include no excerpts, include no citations, include no references, in fact, include no description anywhere within the body of the report that any medical research was done. And the report contains no evidence that the medical research for which the qualified medical evaluator is billing for in any way affects the outcome or the opinions and conclusions of the report. So if you're going to use the medical research complexity factor, it's going to be necessary that the medical research contribute to the opinions and conclusions of your report. And you need to make it clear within the body of the report how your opinions and conclusions have been affected and directed by the medical research that you conducted. Okay? So let me give you a couple examples of medical research and some examples of medical research that I've employed in my evaluations over the years. So first of all, remember that in describing to the parties our use of the complexity factors, we're required to have a separate section at the beginning of our report wherein we elaborate upon all of the complexity factors that we employ in our report. So I reviewed this separate section with you in an earlier video, but as it relates to this video, let me show you how this separate section would look in the case of a case that employs medical research in arriving at the final opinions and conclusions within the body of the report. So here's the report. This is page 1 of the report. Here's the date. Here's the parties. Here's the demographic data. Here's some introductory remarks. And then on the bottom of the page, we begin with our separate section wherein we go into the complexity factors. So here in the separate section, it simply states, in compliance with CCR 9795, this report is being submitted as an ML 104, comprehensive medical legal evaluation involving the following complexity factors, and then we turn the page and we get into all of the complexity factors involved with this particular report. Okay? So the first complexity factor is 2 or more hours of face-to-face time. Second complexity factor is 2 or more hours of record review. Third complexity factor is 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors, which is review of records, face-to-face time, and medical research, which shall count as 3 complexity factors. So what I'm saying in this report is that this report required more than 6 hours combined between face-to-face time, review of records time, and medical research time. And in this report, I'm going to cite the medical research, and the medical research time consisted of 128 minutes itself, more than 2 hours of medical research itself. Now, in this particular report, I described the time involved in the use of medical research under the complexity factor of 6 or more hours. I don't include it as a separate complexity factor, although I certainly could, but that would be simply be redundant. Now, the medical research complexity factor requires that we provide a list of citations and we provide a list of references to the evidence that we relied upon. So this complexity factor here, number 3, wherein I'm describing the use of medical research as a complexity factor, continues, and it states right here, medical research consisted of colon. And here I provide a list of the references and citations that contribute to the opinions and conclusions of this report. So here it is in a bullet point list. And you see I have 4 separate bullets. The first 3 of the bullets contain the references. Number 1 is the Scientific World Journal. Second one is Case Reports in Cardiology. Third one is University of New South Wales National Drug and Alcohol Research Center. And then importantly, the 4th bullet is critical. 4th bullet simply directs the reader of the report to the page later on in the report wherein this medical research is discussed. It says here under the 4th bullet point, it says, see medical research below, page 30. And this is how you begin to prove your use of medical research as a complexity factor. You satisfy the requirement of the separate section in the beginning of your report, wherein you cite your use of medical research as a complexity factor. You provide an abbreviated list of references and citations that constituted your medical research, and then you direct the parties to the appropriate page in your report wherein you discuss these particular studies and wherein you discuss how these particular studies contribute to your opinions and conclusions of your report. And as we said in video number 1 of this discussion, this section of your report here on page 40, wherein you discuss medical research, trust me, the parties are going to go there. When the parties read this complexity factor and they see that you're using medical research as a complexity factor, they're going to go to the page. They're going to go to the page and they're going to read your discussion of medical research, and they're going to do this sort of mental calculation and come to a conclusion as to whether or not you're fabricating your use of medical research as a complexity factor, that perhaps your medical research was not even necessary in arriving at your opinions and conclusions, or on the other hand, that the medical research directly contributes to your opinions and conclusions and was pivotal for the opinions and conclusions of the report. Now, you want the parties to opine in your favor. You want the parties to agree with you that the medical research was critical. It was necessary. It was pivotal. It was necessary. It was essential. That you could not have reached your opinions and conclusions without performing the medical research that you did. Okay? It's how you prove medical research as a complexity factor. Okay, so let's now go to page 30 of the report and see how the medical research is integrated within the body of the report. So I don't have pages number 2 through 29 right here. I just skipped right to page 30. And page 30 is where the causation discussion of the report begins. So the medical research that I conducted in this case was necessary in arriving at opinions and conclusions related to causation. So the medical research is to be found within the causation section of the report. Okay? So just a little bit of background on this case. This was a denied case. It involved a vineyard worker who was claiming an industrial injury post-termination. And what happened was this particular vineyard worker on one particular work day was not feeling well. And at approximately 11 to 12 a.m. in the morning, the vineyard worker discontinued working and went to a nearby emergency room. Went to the emergency room at a nearby hospital. Well, at the emergency room at a nearby hospital, she was diagnosed with symptoms secondary to methamphetamine abuse. She had chest pain symptoms, tachycardia, tachypnea, rapid breathing, arm pain, shoulder pain. The working diagnosis was that she had suffered a cardiac arrest as a result of methamphetamine overdose. Well, as we know, some of these symptoms related to cardiac arrest can mimic musculoskeletal disorders. And so, approximately 2 weeks later, after she had recovered from this incident, she again presented to a different emergency department at a different nearby hospital. Again, she was diagnosed with symptoms consistent with methamphetamine overdose, but for some reason, a couple of months after this, she, on a post-termination basis, filed a retroactive claim for specific injury to arm, chest, thoracic spine, neck, and shoulder, the musculoskeletal regions wherein symptoms of cardiac arrest can manifest. Okay? So I'm a chiropractor. Medical conditions such as cardiac arrest, myocardial infarction, methamphetamine overdose, and all of these things are not within my scope of specialty, but in evaluating her for the neuromusculoskeletal aspect of her claim, it became necessary to do some medical research regarding methamphetamines and lab values, and methamphetamines and cardiac symptoms, and all of these issues related to methamphetamine abuse. So they wanted to know, AOE, COE, are they liable for benefits related to this examinee's claim for industrial injury? And I opined no. My answer was no, in my opinion. Mrs. Jones did not suffer industrial injury with the vineyard. And then I cite my reasons in support of my opinion, no. And I qualify my opinion here as substantial medical evidence. And I go in here into a bullet point reasoning, a bullet point list as to the reasons why. Number one, she was a vague historian. Number two, the mechanism of injury was not consistent with the type of injury she was reporting. And on and on and on, and all these reasons. And look at the great detail on this causation section. More reasons as to why not I didn't feel like she suffered an industrial injury. And then finally here is the medical research. It says medical research, and this is within the causation section of the report. And let me just read to you the introduction statement under medical research and the conclusory statement under medical research. Okay? So under medical research, I state, in order to understand the significance of the findings related to Mrs. Jones' symptoms and any possible association of those symptoms to methamphetamine use, medical research was necessary. So within the body of the report, I explained to the parties why medical research was necessary in arriving at the opinions and conclusions of this report. That's not currently required by current language, but it could be required if the Division of Workers' Compensation's new proposed language is adopted. So I recommend to you that you adopt it as your operating policy. Explain to the parties why. Why is the medical research necessary? Okay? The findings of the medical research support the conclusions and opinions of this report, namely that Mrs. Jones has suffered symptoms related to methamphetamine use and falsely imputes those symptoms to a musculoskeletal injury with Northwest Vineyard Management. Important conclusions from the medical research that I conducted as relates to Mrs. Jones includes. In here, I cite the points from the medical research that relate to Mrs. Jones. And it goes, here's one reference here, the Scientific World Journal, and all the points that relate to Mrs. Jones. And then the next reference, case reports in cardiology, and all the points that relate to Mrs. Jones. The third reference, University of New South Wales, and all the points that relate to Mrs. Jones. And finally, I provide the conclusion. For the reasons above, it is my opinion that Mrs. Jones did not suffer industrial injury on 8/24/16 as alleged, but rather her symptoms were due to non-industrial factors, and those non-industrial factors had to do, at least in part, to 2 episodes of methamphetamine abuse. So this is an example of how medical research was necessary outside of my scope of specialty as a chiropractor, and it was necessary in arriving at the opinions and conclusions that even though she had neuromusculoskeletal symptoms that could be consistent with repetitive work as a vineyard worker, those neuromusculoskeletal symptoms were actually visceral symptoms related to cardiac injury as a result of methamphetamine abuse. Okay? So that's an example of medical research. You might be wondering, well, why would it be necessary, or when would it be necessary to do medical research? The most common use of medical research that I find, and you may have a different discovery, and you may use medical research differently in your reports, but typically I rely on medical research in those cases wherein diagnostic studies, particularly MRI studies, come up with findings, or I should say the medical radiologist interpreting diagnostic studies comes up with findings that I'm not familiar with as a chiropractor. So, for example, many times when you read MRI reports from an imaging facility, the MRI report will contain some language that's commonly used by medical radiologists. It's commonly used within their field of specialty. But within my field of specialty as a chiropractor, these are terms that I'm not readily familiar with. And so for that reason, medical research becomes necessary. So just to give you a couple of examples, I've done medical research on MRI findings of vacuum phenomenon. I've done medical research on MRI findings of Modic type 1 changes. I've done medical research on post-concussion syndrome, Bastrup's kissing spinous disease, avascular necrosis of the hip, Legg-Calvé-Perthes disease of the hip, knee Pellegrini Stieta osteochondritis dissecans. In other words, these are all imaging findings using language common in the field of medical radiology, but not so common in the field of chiropractic. And so medical research in those cases where you get confusing or confounding language from the medical radiologist becomes necessary that you do medical research to investigate the significance of those diagnostic study findings to your particular case. Okay? So that's the use of medical research as a complexity factor. You can use medical research as a complexity factor. I encourage you to use medical research as a complexity factor when it's necessary. And when it is necessary, prove to the parties, number one, that it is necessary, that it was necessary. And then number two, prove to the parties your use of medical research by documenting your medical research first in the separate section at the beginning of your report, and then later on in your report when you refer the reader of the report to the specific section in the report that contains the medical research, make that section of your report very, very impressive. It should be an impressive product if you expect the parties to pay for your use or your claimed use of medical research as a complexity factor. Okay? Okay, so let's shift gears just a little bit. And let's talk about one more issue that can arise after the face-to-face evaluation. And this has to do with the use of the 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors. This is a complexity factor that's contained underneath the ML 104 billing level. So, as it currently is written under CCR 9795, the language of this complexity factor simply states 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors, which shall count as 3 complexity factors. So, if you do medical research, your use of medical research can qualify as a complexity factor even if you don't have 2 hours of medical research, okay? So your time spent on medical research as a complexity factor could contribute to the 6 hours. So for example, you could have 4 hours of face-to-face time, you could have 1 hour and 30 minutes of review of records time. That's a total of 5.5 hours. And then if you had 1 hour of medical research, that would be a total of 6.5 hours, more than enough to qualify for 6 or more hours on any combination of 3 complexity factors. And that's the typical use, or I should say that's the typical application that you're going to find for your medical research. It's atypical and unusual that you would actually require 2 or more hours of medical research. More typically, you may require 20 or 30 minutes of medical research, but you can still capture the medical research as a complexity factor underneath this encompassing complexity factor, which allows for use of medical research under the 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors. Again, the same rules apply. If you're going to use medical research, even if it's only 20 minutes rather than 2 hours, you still need to provide a list of citations in the separate section at the beginning of the report. The separate section should refer the reader to the later section of the report wherein you discuss the medical research, and the medical research section should contribute to the opinions and conclusions of the report. See, the example that I showed you related to the amphetamine abuse, that research was necessary to prove that the examinee did not suffer an industrial injury, but rather she was falsely imputing symptoms related to methamphetamine abuse to repetitious activities at the workplace. Okay? So it was necessary. So this is how you capture medical research, even if you don't have 2 hours of medical research. Now, the Division of Workers' Compensation, of course, has proposed some changes to the language. And this is quite interesting. It changes the language of the 6 or more hours complexity factor. And the change reads as follows. It says 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors, which shall count as 3 complexity factors, provided, and here's the change in the language, provided that some portion of time has been devoted to each of the 3 factors. So with this change of the language, the Division of Workers' Compensation is saying that you cannot use the 6 or more hours complexity factor. See, it reads that when you have 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors, this shall qualify as 3 complexity factors. It says on any combination. So let's say you have 3 hours of face-to-face time, 2 hours of review of records, and 1 hour of medical research. 3, 2, and 1 is 6 hours. That qualifies as 6 or more hours. Well, let's say you had a combination of 5 hours face-to-face, 1 hour review of records, and 0 hours of medical research. 5, 1, and 0. That's a combination. The law says any combination. 5, 1, and 0 is a combination. 4, 2, and 0 is a combination. 4, 2, 4, 1, and 1 is a combination. 3, 2, and 1 is a combination. The law says any combination, but the proposed changes to the language of the law states that you need to have some time, even 1 minute, in all of the three complexity factors. So could be 4 hours face-to-face, 1 hour and 50 minutes of review of records. That's a total of 5 hours and 50 minutes. And then 10 minutes of medical research is all that would be required in order to qualify for 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors. So it's the Division of Workers' Compensation's position that you need to have some time in each of the 3 complexity factors. That 0 time does not qualify as a combination. Now, in my opinion, this does not make sense. In my opinion, this is going to set the stage for doctors doing medical research that's not necessary. It's not necessary. Doctors are going to be doing medical research simply to produce some time within that 3rd complexity factor in order to qualify for the 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors. So the proposed counter language that's been proposed to counteract the Division of Workers' Compensation's proposed changes simply states 6 or more hours spent on any combination of the complexity factors 1 through 3, which shall count as 3 complexity factors. Period. So the proposed counter language simply supports the current existing language of the law as it currently exists under CCR 9795. But this could change. This could change. But as it is right now, 0 time qualifies as a combination under this particular complexity factor, which involves 6 or more hours spent on any combination of the 3 complexity factors. Okay? So just a couple more words about this complexity factor. Now, I said at the beginning that this complexity factor can become important after the face-to-face evaluation. Well, after the face-to-face evaluation, is our review of records done? We stated in previous videos that your review of records is something that can be handled prior to the face-to-face evaluation, and the review of records as a complexity factor can be captured prior to the face-to-face evaluation. Well, during the face-to-face evaluation and after the face-to-face evaluation, medical records continue to be generated. So, for example, it's not uncommon during the face-to-face evaluation to generate 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 pages of new medical records when you consider intake questionnaires, activities of daily living questionnaires, symptom questionnaires, Westry low back questionnaires, all these other documents that are generated during the face-to-face evaluation. Those are then reviewed after the face-to-face evaluation and contribute to your review of records time. Additionally, if you order diagnostic studies, and the reports from those diagnostic studies and any images or printouts or findings from those diagnostic studies that you review following the face-to-face evaluation, that would also contribute to your review of records time after the face-to-face evaluation. So this is a sort of a hybrid complexity factor. This 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors, kind of a hybrid complexity factor that includes components that are captured before, captured during, and even captured after the face-to-face evaluation. So this is a very valuable complexity factor, which if the language of it persists unchanged, you will find yourself employing this complexity factor quite frequently, as most evaluations do involve more than 6 hours on combinations of face-to-face time, review of records time, and in those cases where it is necessary, also on medical research time. Okay? So doctors, I hope this helps you. I hope this discussion gives you new hope that you have more control over the use of the complexity factors than you are currently employing. Now, medical research as a complexity factor is probably more necessary in more of your reports than you're currently using it for. Currently, the language of the law does not require that we provide a statement within the body of our report as to why the medical research was necessary. But my recommendation to you is that you adopt that as if it is the current language of the law, because the parties are going to review your use of the medical research as a complexity factor. And I don't know about you, but if I come upon medical research that does not contribute to the opinions and conclusions of the report, I'm not going to pay for it, and I don't think you would either. I've seen reports wherein doctors conduct medical research, but the medical research does not contribute to their conclusions. In other words, if you're going to ask the parties to pay you dearly for the time involved with medical research and also for the additional cost that the use of medical research escalates the cost of your report by escalating the report up to the ML104 level, if you're going to ask the parties to pay for these compounding costs, you better provide the party with some value for this expense. This expense better be necessary for them. For them in resolving the disputed issues. So doctors, I hope this helps you. The whole philosophy of this discussion has to do with proving your use of the complexity factors. Now, in our next discussion, which will be the final session in this series, we're going to review a series of independent bill review cases wherein doctors' billings for their qualified medical evaluation reports have been downcoded and or reduced by the claims administrator, and as a form of protest and objection, the qualified medical evaluator has submitted the report and the matter to independent bill review for their remediation. So I'm going to share with you the position of independent bill review and their perspective on the use of the complexity factors. And this is going to be very illustrative for you, because it's going to show you and it's going to convince you that now more than ever, the claims administrators and the payers of our QME reports are intimately familiar with the complexity factors under CCR 9795, and they're intimately familiar with the day-to-day, week-to-week changes that are going on with the Division of Workers' Compensation as it relates to the complexity factors, and they're tailoring their reimbursements of the reports to the exact language of the law as it exists at the moment when they decide to pay your bill. So this is going to be a fascinating insight for you. So I look forward to being with you next week on that video. And for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.